Welcome back to Doomer Optimism. I'm Nate. I'm here with Ashley today, as well as James Decker. Hi, James. How are you?
I'm great. How are y'all today?
Good. So I think we had a conversation on Twitter, as many Doomer Optimism episodes start. And James, I've interacted with you a ton. I think mostly this is a vibes-based conversation, just like we connect so well that it seems very fruitful to talk. I think in particular we were talking in this thread about sort of local government in particular, and kind of civic participation, basically, in from the perspective of kind of the localist sort of doomer optimism sensibility that we have. So just to dive in, why don't you introduce yourself, and kind of what you're up to, and we'll kind of just see where the conversation flows from there, if that's all right.
Absolutely. My name is James Decker. I'm the mayor of Stanford, Texas. That is a population about 3,000, a town in West Texas in the rolling plains geographic and vegetative area. It's a very traditional, what you call small town in West Texas, cotton, wheat, cattle. It's kind of the regional trading center. This is the area actually where I was raised here. I was born 2 counties over. My family comes from that vicinity. We moved to Stanford when I was 2, and been here ever since. Went to college, went to law school, and then came back and opened up a law practice here on the square. Proud to say that I registered to vote when I turned 18 in Stanford, and I never changed my voter registration or permanent address away from Stanford, because it was always the intent to come back. And actually, I'm sitting here in my law office on the downtown square on the corner. And I think not everybody always believes me when I say this, but when I was a kid, I wanted this building to be my office. I just thought it had some cool architectural accents to it. It was a building built in 1927 by the local electric utility. And I thought, man, if I could ever get a chance to have an office in Stanford, that needs to be the one. So when I was finishing up law school in the spring of 2009, I bought it, and we started renovating it, and it became my law office. Ran for city council in, I think, 2014, somewhere about, or maybe 2012, somewhere thereabouts. 2-year terms. It's hard to keep track. And then in 2018, I ran against the incumbent mayor and was elected mayor in 2018. And I've been reelected 3 times since then, including this May.
Nice. Okay, cool. We're talking to an actual elected official here. That's amazing. And people might know you on Twitter. I don't know if we said your full name as Shameless Frontier Mayor and Booster, which is a great username. Okay, or handle. So one of the things that precipitated this conversation is this kind of constant accusation of doomer optimism as either a left-wing project or a right-wing project. And so
Right.
maybe we could start by talking a little bit about, I don't know, I guess, like, what drew you to doomer optimism and what your approach is. I mean, I'm guessing you obviously have to take a stand on some issues to be a mayor and, to actually govern and to campaign. But how do you think of yourself? How do your constituents perceive you? And are you just kind of focused more on solving actual local issues versus fitting neatly into one category or another?
There's an old saying that that potholes are neither Republican nor Democrat, and that's something that I very much adhere to. I would say, I grew up in it's a traditional, typical, I'd say fairly stereotypical conservative, rural values type of place. But when you say conservatism in rural West Texas, you're talking about places that were largely the purview of the FDR Democrats in the first half of the 20th century. That the conservative Democrats, the Blue Dogs, were the folks that ran these places and that we elected to Congress and state legislature and all those things for years. And then eventually, a lot of those folks either retired and were replaced by Republicans or switched to the Republican Party I think we didn't have a Republican primary in Jones County until probably 2012 because everybody was Democrats, and then they switched over. So it's largely a conservative, traditional type of place, regardless of what the label is on the beside the person's name. I'm very fortunate. Elections in the state, local elections in the state of Texas are nonpartisan. That's when you get to county office, it's not that way, but city council, mayor, school board, hospital board, your local offices are all nonpartisan, and I take that with a point of pride. And there are some goons within the party activist world at the state level that want to make local elections partisan, basically so you can know whether you can trust a person by the stamp next to their name. And I have said openly, if that ever became a thing in Texas, I would simply refuse. Somebody asked me what party I belong to. I belong to the party of George Washington. None whatsoever. Just because, I was raised as a child to vote for the person, not the party, and vote for principle. That's something that we've gotten away from, and we try to do I call it the red team, blue team nonsense, and we cheer it on like it's sports. We'll get to him, I'm sure, at length in this, but Wendell Berry talks about when people lose a fidelity to a place, they have to find some sort of tribalism to belong to, and that's when politics replaces place and nationalism replaces patriotism. And so I don't participate in that at all. I just refuse whatsoever. And kind of I wrote this in sort of a statement of principles earlier this week on my Substack, West of 98. But really in the early 2010s, and as the partisanship in America really got just really started to get toxic, even before the 2016 election, I just found myself just withdrawing from that completely because rural politics were largely farm bills and conservation programs, and rural economic development often didn't fit within the boundaries of those national partisanship. And I saw that the partisanship was creating even more toxicity, and that's about the time I started really reading Wendell Berry super deeply, and realized, kind of found a kindred spirit who's 50 years older than me, who I always tell people that if you read Wendell and you think he agrees with your politics, keep reading, because he'll probably offend you in the next paragraph. And I just found that's kind of where I found my localism, that I realized that I don't care about getting to elected to any other office other than being mayor. Mayor is not a stepping stone. People keep asking me when I want to run for county judge or state legislature, that sort of thing. I don't. I want to help the people of Stanford. I moved back to this community for a reason, to throw myself into it and help ensure that the community has a future in a world in which rural communities, that is in doubt. And, I think about the famous line from the Civil War when, David Farragut, Admiral, is told, is told that the torpedoes are out there, and he says, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Like, that's kind of how I feel about partisanship. Like, I don't care. People can tell me that I have to choose a political side, I have to choose a party, and, damn the political parties, full speed ahead is kind of my policy. One of the greatest compliments I've ever received, and I think actually I said it in a tweet to Nate, is we had a candidate for statewide office that was here visiting, because I have maintained that any person that's running for statewide office, I would like to visit with them. I'll converse with them on Twitter, talk to them on the phone, I'll text with them, I'll invite them to Stanford, I'll give them a tour, and because I want them to know our perspective and hopefully inform them about rural issues. And I don't care what party they belong to, and I don't care about what's in their platform. I just want to talk about rural issues. And one of those candidates came to visit with me a couple of years ago, and I heard later that he told somebody else that, I can't tell if this guy's a Republican or Democrat. I just think he wants to help his local community, and that's all that matters to him. And that's exactly right. So he pegged me correctly.
Nate.
So what, yeah, obviously we can dig more into the political stuff, but before we do that, the thing that jumped out at me most is you just said it about, I just care about rural issues. What are rural issues?
You know, it's all of those things that keep our places, that keep our places alive. And back in the 2022 gubernatorial election here in Texas, I tried to outline some of those things that I thought truly mattered, and posted them kind of out on Facebook to try to get people to listen, or and Twitter as well. And I kind of called it five. I came up with 5 rural priorities, which are very basic, nothing sexy or unusual here, but internet, rural broadband was something that was very important. Economic development, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. So, we see, healthcare has been an incompetent mess in the United States for decades now. But rural Texas has taken the brunt of that. When people talk about the peril of rural hospitals and rural healthcare and rural hospitals closing, I was elected mayor in Stanford on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, 2018. At the end of that month, our inpatient hospital and emergency room closed. And not only did we lose and it had been on the struggle bus and in barely alive for years, through some local issues, but also just the larger dynamics. And that cost about 30 jobs. And we left us without an emergency room within, a 15-minute drive. So we know that is very real. The challenges there, because it's hard to get people to move to a town if they don't have decent health care. It's hard to get old people to stay here. It's hard to get major employers who work in any sort of, dangerous occupation. And, rural jobs are inordinately and weighted towards more dangerous jobs because they're more physical. They require more machinery and that sort of thing. Education, you've got to educate your people. School choice and all that sort of thing is a raging topic in Texas. But a school is the lifeblood and the center of a small community. I'm not here to defend anything what urban public education, suburban public education happens. I don't care about that nonsense. I care about a town of 3,000 that has a football stadium that holds 7,000 people. And on Friday night, our Stanford Bulldogs kick off district play. They're number 1 in the state. And that's the place where everybody is.
They're number 1 in the state?
Yes, we are number 1 in the state. We've got Stanford has won 6 state titles, 4 in the 50s and 2 in the 2010s. But this year is like the recycling. It's the year we've got the senior laden team, super talented. Our coach that won this 2 state titles in the 2010s came out of retirement. I mean,
oh my
everybody
God, that's insane.
About Bulldog football. And
now I'm just thinking about the Dillon Panthers.
Hey, I had friends from out of state that come here to watch Bulldog games and talk about the fact that it reminds them of Friday Night Lights, the TV show.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Our town's a little smaller. Some of the things are not realistic in the show. That drives me nuts. But there are threads of that. It's very much the school is the center of community culture. We root for those kids. They're, our kids, my daughters are 3 and 6. They look up to those cheerleaders. They look up to those football players. They say they want to go watch so-and-so cheer. We go to the pep rallies on Friday. We have a very successful FFA, UIL academics, band, one-act play. Like, our school is the center of the community. And it's important, kids love, so much whether your kids come back to your town is what kind of experience they have in your schools, and whether it makes them love the community or hate the community. There was a, I would say, well-known or locally famous incident last year. The baseball team all dyed their hair blonde for the playoffs. And everybody in town was like, oh my gosh, not in a bad way, but just amazed. And so I volunteered and I dyed my hair platinum blonde with them. Because it was a way to connect those kids to the community and let the adults in the community that may be a little bit more fuddy-duddy to say, hey, what these kids are doing is fun, and it makes them love our community even more. And then that other stuff, you talk about broadband and infrastructure. I mean, we've got to have the stuff that makes our people, that makes our places livable, help from the state to pay for water and sewer infrastructure. Stanford has invested about $30 million and that sort of stuff, on projects that are finishing up and starting right now. Economic development, when it comes to rural economies, we have a tendency to the states, and I'm sure other states are the same as well. But all the crap that they don't want to look at in their suburban backyard, they throw it. They throw it to us out here in rural communities like throwing a bone to a starving dog, and expect us to have their prisons and their wind farms and their solar farms and the stuff that they would never actually try to do in their own backyards. So it's that my goal has been to work on a true local economy, the Wendell Berry model of an economy that's built on neighborliness and community. And how do we get back to that? Because that's been, we're decades in the hole in commodity agriculture and the get big or get out nonsense where, our communities are surrounded by fields and they have a higher food insecurity and poverty rate than the national average, which is asinine. So how do we help local communities feed their people first and foremost? So that's my vision as mayor and what I call rural issues.
And let's help me imagine what a healthy, thriving rural economy in 2024 looks like.
I would say that's a very difficult question that I don't know that I have the answer on. But I think,
it doesn't. I'll just add that I'm sure it doesn't look the same everywhere. This is the thing I think as often people talk about rural issues and like they're all the same. And I mean, that's just very not true. It depends a lot on what's your resource base, where you're at. You hear people talk a lot of, where they have in beautiful scenery, where there's a lot of tourism. That might be a thing which the locals will often resent a lot. Or there's, agriculture, various types of agriculture. So it's not obvious, like not all rural economies are going to look the same, but like what would be, I wonder, I just think about this a lot. I'm curious what common threads would be, what might be strong rural economies.
Yeah. And let me just tag onto that. James, to what extent do you also think when you're trying to imagine your own, like Stanford, Texas, and what your vision is there, and, obviously working with local people and their vision and the local culture, et cetera. But to what extent are you also like kind of keyed into global issues? Like, are you a cosmolocalist? Are you thinking like, what kind of agency do I have here in this global economy, and how can I make it work in my local place?
That's where you get deeply into the Paul Kingsnorth and the idea of the machine.
Yeah.
So I have thought about that a lot, and and my friend, I don't know if y'all know him, y'all should have him on here, Miles Wernz. He's a professor over at Abilene Christian University of ethics and theology. He's actually I know him locally. He's a personal friend. He writes at Front Porch Republic and in a lot of different places. He's actually written some books on Christian pacifism and Dorothy Day and a lot of really cool stuff. But Miles wrote about the problem with the end result of the Kingsnorth, the raging against the machine, that if you just totally fight against the machine and refuse to accept it, the end result of that is you end up like the Unabomber, that you just become so like you realize that I can't fight this, I have to destroy it. So you have to balance. You have to balance yourself so you don't put yourself in that position. Yeah. So it's that idea of living within the machine and living within the global context to say, hey, I can't blow all of this up and I don't need to. And that's a terrible idea for many reasons. But how do we make our communities more, how do our communities thrive within it? And Wendell's, the idea of a local economy or the total economy, it's named two different things depending on where you read it. He talks about how you should base your economy on neighborliness and providing the things within community that you need, and then you figure out how to sell the surplus and how you where your folks don't need it, how do you sell that within the market? And I see that within the context of rural broadband and remote jobs and that sort of thing, where in a perfect, we're sitting on Zoom, we're all involved in Twitter. I'm guessing all three of us have smartphones. I would love maybe to go back to a pre-internet world, that would be great. But I also know that that's not, practical. And I know, I'm not one of these technological hypocrites where I say, man, I'm glad, yes, I do hate being on Facebook. I wish I could get off Facebook for some point, but I also know Facebook has been an extraordinarily useful way for me to communicate with our citizens in times of emergency. During COVID, during 2021, when the Texas power grid failed and Stanford was one of those places that was without power for over 40 hours, and then we had to get our water and sewer systems back online in the days that followed. Like, Facebook is a very helpful tool for communication used in its proper context and when you're not doom scrolling. So you look at how do we live within that context. And as much as I would love for Stanford to go back to 1920, 1930, when we had multiple fruit stands, grocery stores, meat markets, all downtown, instead of Walmart being the only place where people can shop for groceries. But I also know that we got to get there. And farmers market alone, we've got a farmers market here that's growing slowly but surely. Farmers market alone is not gonna solve that, because people are so far out of the pattern of buying their goods locally. And we've got lots of folks that are on, fixed incomes, that are on SNAP, getting SNAP and WIC, support for supplemental nutrition. And the state makes it very difficult for that money to be used as to help, to support individual growers. So it's very much a grocery store and supermarket and Walmart enrichment scheme in a lot of ways by design. So I don't live in a nostalgic world that's not practical. So what I see as important is that we provide jobs that can be brought in through rural broadband, through remote jobs. Encourage people that, hey, if you want that small town atmosphere, if you want that rural life, if you want to truly build community and you can work anywhere, come do it in a place like Stanford, and then pursue your hobbies. We've got some people who've done just that, that they've started, some folks that started a martial arts center. We haven't had karate in Stanford in probably 20 years at least. Some others that are bakers, or that are trying other different pursuits and helping grow that local market economy. It's very much a piecemeal thing. Our community, or our world, loves magic bullets. That's the technocratic ideals of climate change solutions are all based on a magic bullet that we pay somebody a bunch of money to save us. But it's little incremental steps that we encourage everybody in the community to participate in. And that's how you build a thriving and vibrant local economy. And I'm fully aware that may not be something that happens in my lifetime. I may be dead before that's truly possible. And that's what I rely on Wendell's line from the Mad Farmer Manifesto: plant sequoias. Do good work, lay that groundwork, do the right things, even if you never even if you never experience the results of it. It's good. It's good work for the sake of it.
I love this so much. Yeah. So a couple of different reflections. First of all, I feel like I've kind of come around on this whole arc myself individually to now, like, this radical recommitment to the place where I grew up. And it's just so cool to see, like, one thing I've been saying about doomer optimism, there's all these different, podcasts out there that talk like a lot about the doom, but there's not as many out there who have guests who have thought about the doom a decade or 2 decades ago and have been living their lives in solutions for that entire time and have all these insights from it. And I would definitely put you in that category. It's like, I'm just now kind of dipping my toe into this world of commitment to place, and like, what can I do with local politics, and how can I make a difference, and how can I think long term? And it's so inspiring to hear you talk about this radical commitment to place rather than this striverism of like, well, what's next? Or how can I get more power? Or how can I, leave this place and go climb up some ladder or whatever? But instead, like, no, I'm really just, I'm focused on this particular place. And it's like nowadays, it's like a radical thing to do, to just focus on a place and not, move beyond that. And it's so cool to hear you talk about all the things that you've had to navigate in that, where it's not just, it's not so hunky-dory, it's not so straightforward of like, oh yeah, just show up and, like a local mayor in 1920, it would be a totally different world. But now you're fighting against all these global forces. One other thing I just want to say is, sorry, I'll just briefly end with this article I wrote, which is the case for left conservatism. I wrote it on Unheard. A bunch of people responded like, I love this. This is my politics. It's about local. It's about place. It's about solving specific local issues. And a lot of my more conservative friends were like, this is fake. This doesn't exist. There's no such thing as left conservatism. And I was like, I do think it exists. And it's really nice to meet you. I feel like I'm less crazy now because there's an actual person here in front of me who's embodying this idea that I, put together in that essay.
So that left conservatism article, that was actually how I discovered you. I was driving to a court hearing up in the Panhandle, and I saw that on my friend Haddon Turner, our agrarian friend from across the pond in England. He shared that, and I read that, and I remember where I was driving between Aspermont and Guthrie, which won't mean anything to y'all, but so Guthrie is where the 4 Sixes Ranch are, that Taylor Sheridan, Yellowstone, all of that.
Okay.
I was driving on that lonely stretch of highway, which there's nothing out there other than canyons and red rolling hills, and it's beautiful, it's quiet. And I read that article as I was driving down the highway. Yes, I was reading my phone while driving, probably not the best thing to take to publicly, but I read that and I was like, wow, this is it. And I sent it to several people. Same thing. I sent it to several older conservative folks, and I was like, hey, this is what you believe. And they were just like, well, I don't know about that. It seems like you could tell the left conservatism label really bothered them. It was like, I don't know about that. But I was like, hey, this distrust of, big business and big government, this is what rural people believe. So
yeah, right. And maybe there is no word that would satisfy people in the current world in which we live, because I think part of it is you need to have this heuristic of like, you're on my same team, you kind of get what I'm talking about. So that's why people like these labels, because it's like we really are in a kind of chaotic society where there's so many risks going on, and people are just like, I just want to know who's like on my side. And so it's reasonable that people want that team sports, and maybe there is no label that will like ever work.
And they don't want to think about it. I need this label that will tell me I'm comfortable. Okay, I can approach this person. I can trust this person. And without having to inquire further, but it just doesn't.
The problem with this in the political realm is like you get that heuristic real quickly. Okay, a D or R, this person are on my team. Those people are not on your team.
Yeah,
they are just not working for you, and entrusting them is a mistake. They're not looking out for you, and especially if you're in a rural area, like neither team.
And everything is based on social media, what catch in cable news, what catches people's attention quickly. One great thing I love about Wendell Berry, and it's frustrating when you want to tweet his quotes, is his quotes do not even remotely fit into even the 280 characters on Twitter. And so it's like, and it's a lesson that, hey, good ideas and change in the world and improving things is not meant to be boiled down into a 2-sentence soundbite, even though that's what sells. So, how do we keep people's attention when they don't have attention spans to discuss these good ideas? Because good ideas take time and words.
Yep. Nate, did you have something you want to follow up with?
I'm curious about, I'm just honing in really on these rural issues because it's what I, think about a lot, and rural economy and such. And I wonder, in rural culture, and I wonder the degree to which, obviously, you can look out and see all the ways that rural areas have been, and again, it's not a monolith, different rural areas experience things differently. In the Midwest here, I feel like we've kind of actually been through a sort of a social Armageddon for the last 20 or 25 years. It's not really worsening right now, I don't think, but it did 20 years ago. So we were kind of, ahead of the curve of maybe some places, I think, with the farm closures in the 80s and whatnot. And then the industrialization of the Midwest kind of it's happened. it's sort of bottomed, I think. I mean, not that there couldn't be lower to go, but I kind of think it's just sort of where it is. But I wonder about the well, I want to hone in on the issue of rural broadband, because I think you might, there might be different people might see that differently too. Because when you bring in a lot of remote workers, things like that, I think, and this is going to depend a lot, I think, on where you're at. You worry about changing the bringing in a lot of outsiders, bringing in a lot of city people, things like that might change the texture of a community versus, yeah, well, we do need actually a bigger economic base. That's just reality. Like, no one lives here. No one's here to do the work. No one's here to have kids. Like, no one's here. We have to bring in people. Which is what I see in the area I live. It's like, we just need people. We need people. We need people with jobs. That's really important. And broadband seems to me like a really good way to do that. But another perspective is that, like, no, we don't want that. We want to, build it ourselves. We don't want people coming in and changing who we are.
Can I just jump in and briefly say from an urban perspective, I think part of it too is it's not necessarily people, it's that you don't want the culture changed. It's like local culture versus globalist culture. And that's, to me, like the distinction, because it's like a lot of people will come in and they'll be like not from the area and just a remote worker, and it's like, well, we're not actually just like a homogenous like global blob here. We actually have a specific culture that like has persisted through generations, and like if it's, you want to be welcoming to outsiders, but if it gets too diluted, then the culture just goes away. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I think about a lot. We saw that in COVID, and I've read some articles about that, about people that moved, that had second houses or moved to vacation areas or owned an Airbnb in the mountains or some touristy place, and then they just moved out there and stayed, and it changed the local dynamic. Changed the culture. It was, well, we moved to this place. Now we want everything to be like it was the place that we left. And that's a challenge. You look in the counties to the east of us, you drive 2.5 hours east of here, and you get to the outer suburbs of Dallas, Fort Worth, or Fort Worth at least. And in 20 years, those places look completely different now than they did when I was in, high school or as a kid going to like a Texas Rangers game. Weatherford, Decatur, these towns that had really cool, unique culture. Like Weatherford was it was an old stop on the Chisholm Trail. It's where Charlie Goodnight brought, Oliver Loving back, and Oliver Loving is buried there. And now it's a suburb with all the same chain restaurants and all the same, my friend Alan Cornett from the Cultural Debris podcast, he talks about that, that architecture. And you look at American architecture and how every place looks the same, has the same highways, has the same chain restaurants, has the same big box stores, and they're all different. Like a suburb in DFW is no different than a suburb in Los Angeles or Chicago or Atlanta, and that's not local culture. That's that homogenized culture. It's what Wendell talks about in the work of local culture, which I would consider the single most important essay to me personally in my work, where he talks about local culture is the centripetal force that holds a place together like soil. And TV, he wrote that really before the advent of the internet, but television, how television homogenized the culture and put into all of our living rooms the idea of culture that Madison Avenue sold to all of us. And well, so you think locally, that had so much of a deleterious effect on rural communities, because if the ideal culture is the urban and suburban culture, well, you should go live that, or you should bring that here. But if you're bringing it here, then it's just a less low rent version of the ideal in the big city. So just move to the big city.
100%, man. And you hear that all the time growing up. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Southern Illinois, and it's just like that's sort of a common thread.
Yeah.
With rural kids in general. Now there's not all. I mean, there's a lot of local kids that are not interested, but like a huge chunk, it's like, this place is boring. There's nothing to do, right? Because the idea of something to do and something exciting is what you're discussing. It's the thing it's the thing that's out there. It's the, the exciting concerts or whatever. I like concerts too, don't get me wrong, but it's that idea that's, you're saying, kind of being sold, and that we just internalize. Rural people just sort of internalize that, yeah, like either this is either we can go there, or kind of hopefully maybe build a low rent version here of what that is, which is kind of less good, but it'll do, because I guess there's some good things, blah blah blah, but it doesn't really value the pride and the and the uniqueness of your place.
That's exactly right. And so as I have, let's say, as I have worked on the concept of bringing jobs locally in the rural broadband and those questions, that's something I've been very mindful of, is how do we turn this place into the best version of itself and not just bring people in for the sake of it. And it's a balance. I was talking to a friend yesterday, actually, come by my office about something else, and we were talking about how, Stanford is a town that peaked in population in the 1950 census at just over 5,000. It was laid out for 10,000, platted, in streets and blocks and that sort of thing. And now the population is 3,000. So you've got twice as much infrastructure as you need, with half of the tax base that it was designed to be paid for. And the strong towns movement, it's primarily more of an urban thing, but it's something that really makes a lot of sense that I have read their stuff. It talks about how we set up a car-centric infrastructure in the country, and we considered how to pay for it, to build it, without ever figuring out how to maintain it and having a mechanism to keep it up. And you see that in places like Stanford, where our streets are terrible. And we've got what's funny is our best streets in town are our brick streets downtown, streets that were laid in the 1910s and 1900s. And, they're streets that are 110 years old, and they're way better than your asphalt streets that were laid in the 1960s. So we don't have the money to repave every street in town, even if we wanted to, because 3/4 of those streets have really terrible water lines underneath them. So, we're engaged in trying to repair and replace those water mains so that we can put a good street back on top of it. But so you've got to figure out some way. As I told my friend yesterday, I said, there's a certain element of people that want everything to stay exactly the same. They don't want to pay any more for it. They want you to have more to do in town, and they don't want anybody new upsetting their dynamic.
So you can't have all those things, right?
Exactly. The math doesn't math, as they say.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act. How do we attract people into town but also retain the culture? It's really cool. So I'm the mayor, and we've got 5 city council members in addition to me. There's one of those 5 was born in Stanford. I came here when I was 2, so I wasn't born here, but I was pretty close to it. But only 2 of us graduate from high school here. And 2 of them, everybody else has lived here for at least 20 years, except 2 of them, both of whom moved here in the last 6 to 8 years, basically because they wanted to be part of a small rural community, have that small town atmosphere, and make it better. So it's them looking at how can we, and one of those people, actually both work remotely. And it was, how can we be part of the local culture, and how can we make it better, and how can we volunteer our time, even though we don't have a pre-existing connection and we had never been to Stanford before we looked at a house here. So I think it's there. I think it's my friend Jeff Murphy, who y'all should definitely have on. He's a farmer in Kansas. He's doing a lot of local.
Jeff, I love Jeff. I interact with Jeff all the time.
Jeff is awesome. He posted something the other day that got really me to thinking. It was like, we all want like good, dynamic, hardworking, forward-thinking people to move to our town, but there's not some mysterious well of those people just waiting to be tapped. Like, it doesn't exist. There's not a repository of those people waiting to move here. What I have thought about, and this was something that my dad said when I was probably 20 years ago, that somebody was talking about, in the same breath, they were talking about, how do we make Stanford better? And then talking about how, well, they just told their kids just to move away and never come back. And he said, how can our town be good enough for somebody else's kids if it's not good enough for our own kids? Mm-hmm. And I thought about that a lot. So it has to start with wanting to get your local people to come back. If you have a town that never has any local people want to come back, there's probably some systemic things with the culture that are bad. And that's how you end up with a town that culture completely changes from what made it great. You got to start with creating and facilitating a reason for your local people to stay or want to come back. bring them back to the farm or encourage them to start a business or be back in, encourage them to buy an existing local business. And then, I had 55 in my graduating class. I'm going to say probably anywhere from a third to a half of those folks are either here, like never left or came back or spend a significant amount of time here. Stanford really, in the Gen X generation and the millennial generation, those people that, didn't come back. They just didn't. My generation, I'm the elder millennial and younger. We've got a really strong core group of people that have come back for various reasons. It was already already underway before I moved back to town. And those people encourage other young people to come to town. We've got, the renewable energy construction in this part of the world is a whole nother thing. I have mixed feelings about that and what to what extent it is good. But Stanford is a hub where a lot of those folks working those construction jobs have moved. Either, there's some who've lived here in a travel trailer, then decided to buy a house. And you've got to make a place that's livable for your young people, because family, people are people. People are the same. People want the same things. Ashley, your example in Chicago is a really good one. One of my best friends from law school was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Had never went to college, Erie, Pennsylvania, moved to Lubbock, Texas to go to law school, which was a radical culture shock. And then she graduated from law school and moved to Pittsburgh. But she and I are still good friends and we talk regularly. And what she and I talked about is like the similarity of rural communities and urban neighborhoods. That like the idea of community and neighborliness, those things still exist. You end up with a sprawling suburbs where you don't ever talk to anybody in your neighborhood. That is kind of the difference between those two, that is kind of disconnected. But urban communities and rural communities have that same, like, we stay within a general geographic and neighborliness. And so when you talk about these principles of community, they run across. We don't have to have everybody move to a rural community. We shouldn't. We need to have healthy, vibrant urban centers, and the principles are the same.
Totally. This is so funny because last night I'm talking to my brother-in-law, Patrick's brother, and he's a Chicago fireman, and there's like a whole culture around the Chicago Fire Department. My dad was a fireman, a lot of my uncles were, so like there's just a whole culture with it. And we're just talking about like how much we kind of went away from our neighborhood culture and then kind of came back to it and really appreciate it. But even all of us who are committed to the neighborhood, and he is committed to this like very, very Chicago job, we're talking about, I'm like, yeah, it's like, but do I encourage the girls, my 3 girls, to find a neighborhood guy? Do I say that that's what you want to do? And Pat's a neighborhood guy to me, and so we found each other, and we're like the uniting of 2 clans in this neighborhood, and it's actually like super powerful, and we didn't realize it at the time, but we were all laughing at that, like, oh, do you have him find a neighborhood guy? Because the assumption is that you can just find whoever, you go to college, you just marry whomever from whatever town, it doesn't really matter. And I'm like, if you actually think about the practical realities of it, if you find someone from the neighborhood, it makes things so much practically easier. If you've got grandparents both in the same area, you're like combining the force of these 2 families who already know each other. But it's just so funny because like we're still struggling internally to accept the logic of this, So anyways, and
it's a
Nate.
huge internalized culture shift, what you're
Yeah.
talking about here, right? Like it's way deep in there. The idea of going out to make your fortune, to meet your spouse, to get your education, to pursue your career, to pursue your dreams, like it's out there. And
it's like
the idea of staying is it's synonymous, I think, still with the idea of settling, right? Like, okay, I'll settle for this, I'll settle, like literally it's to settle, right? But there is a negative connotation to that. Like that's like you could have done better, but you just kind of decided to not.
Well, and remember, Nate, maybe it was a year ago when we were discussing whether or not I should come back from Uruguay, and I was like struggling with this. remember we had this conversation about marriage and just committing to a person, and then whatever happens within the confines of that commitment, the bounds of the commitment are set. And then there's a ton of agency within that of how you can like thrive within that boundary. But I feel like the same thing can be true about place, and especially if you encourage it and say like there's a lot of really amazing things. And I'll just say one other thing and then I want to ask you a question, James. Um, Part of what drew us back is the culture around families and school sports, and like hearing you talk about the football team is amazing because there's a ton of camaraderie there, and like our kids run with the neighbor kids, and we didn't have that in Uruguay where they like knock on each other's, they're coming and knocking on our door every single day, ringing the doorbell, the neighbor girls, and they're riding their bikes around together, and they're singing songs, and they're going and getting like a milkshake and a burger together, and it's just like so wholesome, and they're playing sports together, and I'm getting to meet the other parents, and there's like everyone's excited about cheering on the team, and you've got that like rivalry. We've got a couple of rival schools, and you go to those games, and everybody goes to the games, and you see a ton of people, and I'm like, so to me, a lot of people my age have come back to the neighborhood in the past couple of years, and I'm like a medium millennial, I think, or maybe on the older side. And it's been really cool, and I think for a lot of people it's surrounded the family issue of like, I want my kids to kind of know this neighborhood culture, and you bring them to other places where you're kind of like a globalist in like the suburbs or even in like LA or New York City, and it's like, I'm not really from anywhere, I don't really belong anywhere, and we don't want that. And so I was wondering, maybe James, if you could make the case against striverism for localism, like why, thinking even generationally, like why is this good to commit to a place?
So there was an article at Plow last year about a year ago, called "Why Are We Lonely?" And it talked about that. And it talked about that striverism and upward mobility, about how that has left us like completely unhappy. We're searching to improve ourselves, but all it has done is pulled apart our roots. They're like, oh, I can't stay in the village. I'm better than that.
Yeah.
And it has left us searching nonstop. And actually, that article actually talks about, it references Tocqueville and Democracy in America, talking about how that local rootedness was essential to happiness in America. And, I think about Wallace Stegner. He wrote about the boomers and the stickers. And the boomers, his family were boomers that were, his dad, complicated relationship with his family, and his dad died in the murder-suicide and all of that. That's, Big Rock Candy Mountain is based on his family. And they're always moving from boomtown to boomtown, trying to find his dad to get his next big thing, his next, score that was going to work. And there's a letter from Stegner to Wendell Berry, where, of course, Berry was one of his students at Stanford, where Stegner actually, I don't know that jealousy is the right word, but he admired Berry's status as a sticker. That Berry's family was in Henry County, Kentucky. His dad was a lawyer. His brother was a lawyer. Had been there for 7 generations. And Stegner didn't have that. And Stegner always felt like something was missing in his life because he didn't have that. And that's why he committed himself to the farm at Palo Alto, because he was trying to find a place to make his own.
Yeah.
Because he saw that, and it is the history of the West, the destruction of, the terrible extraction of resources, the rain follows the plow, a whole bunch of nonsense that he saw, unhappiness, environmental destruction, people losing their lives, mental health. We can talk about that more because that's something very near and dear to me. Based on people just trying to find the Big Rock Candy Mountain over the next hill. And it really does matter. And it runs contrary to every sensibility that we have to move up and move forward. When I was in junior high, I've written this in an essay. When I was in junior high, I told they wanted our career goals and everything. And my goal was to come back to Stanford. And this assistant principal, who was not from here and didn't stay very long, and I don't know where he is and don't care, but he it basically was like, well, you can do better than that. You should be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer. Like you're
Yeah.
smarter than to stay in Stanford.
You
Yeah.
gotta
And
make
that's like,
you gotta make something of yourself.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You know, that's why I get like people who ask me what I'm going to run when I'm going to run for higher office. Like to some degree, local folks, I know they care because they think I can do so much for the world, all that sort of thing. It's great. But there's a little bit of like offense that like I want to change the mindset of like, what's wrong with the office I've got now? Like I don't want to go stand in a legislature with 150 people and get nothing done for 6 months.
Well,
out
and
of the year.
actually, like a lot of people don't realize, and this is like really a false premise because a lot of people don't realize you, James, have so much more power in this office of mayor, so much more agency to actually change things than like just at the point we are in this, American experiment. The higher up you go, the less power you have. It's kind of just like steering a ship that's already kind of going in a direction. And the more people I talk to at the highest levels of politics are like, I can't do anything. It doesn't really even matter that. I mean, there's very little agency and movement in there.
You're already at the top of the mountain, so to speak.
You are, yeah, right. You already are.
Well, and I wanted to make sure not to fall off this though. I wanted to because you were talking about Wallace Stegner and Wendell Berry, and there's really a cool cohort of people and authors in that little community. You know, they were I think one of the best novels written about this was from that same group of people. Ken Kesey wrote "Sometimes a Great Notion." I don't know if you've read that.
So I have not read any Ken Kesey, but he's in that Stegner Fellowship, and I really need to read him.
Sometimes a Great Notion, at least as far as, I mean, his famous book is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I don't know, I haven't read that since high school, but and then he's famous for all the exploits of the merry pranksters and whatnot in California. But Sometimes a Great Notion is extremely relevant to this conversation. It's a Western family that kind of tells in brief the story of their travel to the West, to kind of stopping in Oregon, and sort of like kind of describes it in a way that sheds some light on the family culture and the mindset of boomers, basically. And then how boomers kind of become stickers, but then conflict within a family, and kind of the idea of going and making yourself like a block. All this stuff is in that novel. I'm not going to describe the whole novel right now, but it's really excellent, and it's just of a piece with the thinking of Stegner and of Berry. Like it's you can tell they were all friends. They were all a lot. They work together, were in communication with one another. Kesey's work is very continuous with Berry's work, which is super fascinating to me personally, just because they're in some ways, so you put them in very different cultural boxes. You've got the hippies and Kesey's association with the hippies, and Berry's just staying in place. But they were good friends and had a really similar perspective. And Sometimes a Great Notion is an outstanding book about this.
And I'm actually adding that to my cart on bookshop.org right now as a so I don't forget it while we're talking about that. But you're right. Edward Abbey, the same thing. I'm not sure Edward Abbey's value in many ways could be any more different from Berry. I mean, he like rejected monogamy and all this just wildness, but the values of like you read Desert Solitaire and those Monkey Wrench Gang and those books, very much it all fits. It all fits.
Yeah.
It's easily labeled. But
it is against the corporate government overscaled like globalist rot. That's what it is. I mean, and whatever it's against that same thing, but then whatever form it takes for them as individuals. This is why like somebody like Andy Hickman, who's like all about, nomadism, and then, Wendell Berry, who's all about like being in a specific place, can both comport, because it's really just about some amount of authenticity and some humane way of living that's connected
without being controlled by the machine, without being told that we have to do something because the machine said that was our spot.
That was the and that was the sort of of course we can all talk about how it went wrong and this and that, but that was the short-lived experiment of the the hippies, specifically the merry pranksters, and Kesey's involvement there. Like that was what that was, and there was something inside of that. Of course, it was young and got mixed up with a lot of, a lot of ways went bad, but there was at the core of that, a kernel of that exact thing you're describing, Ashley.
Yeah, totally, totally. I've got a question. James, to what extent are people around your area? I don't really know that much about like the ecology out there. I'm assuming it's pretty dry. We had a talk at the Wagon Box when we just had this event in Wyoming a little while back, about a month ago. And we had Peter Allen, who's been on the show quite a bit, talking about like, basically Eastern ecology and what a vision for the environment would be, and land management. And then we had Hal Herring, who's like an environmental journalist who's written a long time on issues of the West, talk about what you would do in the West. So I'm just wondering, is there any interest in regenerative ranching out there? Is there like any interest in land stewardship and ecology? What's the read on the environmental things in your area?
Absolutely. So, yeah, Hal Herring, by the way, he and I have a mutual friend, Ed Robertson, the Mountain and Prairie podcast that I was on it years ago. Hal's been on there several times, and they're personal friends, and he thinks the world of him.
Oh, that's cool. And Hal had no idea really about doomer optimism, and he came to this event and he was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad to be invited to this. I feel so much less lonely now." And I was like, that is like the nicest compliment for somebody like Hal, who's just been thinking about these things for a long time. But then, he always gets labeled by the techno-optimists as like backwards or a Luddite or conservative or, a deplorable because he doesn't agree with those things. But he's deeply ecological. So it was cool. It's cool. I'm loving this like umbrella we're building here.
Absolutely. We're just a wide, diverse set of, the agrarians and the hippies, and,
Yeah.
the farther,
Misfits.
like, exactly right. We're all here together just caring about our local place, whatever it is.
Hippies and cowboys, the Cody Jinks song, Hippies and Cowboys.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. There's a whole lot more similarities than they realize, than they want to talk about, because it makes them both uncomfortable. But so the name of my Substack is West of 98. And where that comes from is Walter Prescott Webb, who's a famous historian of Texas. He wrote History of the Texas Rangers, but he also wrote a book called The Great Plains. And he was the one that posited that the 98th meridian is where the Great Plains began. And that was where the rainfall petered out, became more sporadic and irregular, and that Eastern agricultural methods, which were largely imported from Europe, no longer worked.
Yeah.
That you had to adapt your agriculture, and so goes agriculture, so goes culture. You had to adapt your agriculture, your culture, and your institutions to the land, not vice versa. He was looking, within this was written in 1931. So we're looking a decade after the disaster of the Dust Bowl, when they tried to plow up the grasslands and turn it all to wheat. And we saw how well that worked. So that's the land in which we live. Stanford is just west of that line. We're at about 99 and 99.47 is our meridian. Stegner, said the 100th meridian was where it began, but the reality is 98 was a lot closer to being accurate. So we're in that arid rainfall. They say our average rainfall is like 22 or 3 or 4 inches, but I'd say it's closer to like 17 or 18. It is sporadic. We have droughts. It gets really hot in the summer, and really cold in the winter. We're limited in what we can grow. We can't grow corn. We can't grow soybeans. We're mostly dry land, cotton, wheat, and cattle. When you talk about the regenerative world, we have a lot of folks who have those ideas, who largely agree with them. Trying to implement them within the boundaries of their bankers and crop insurance, can be a challenge. And they can't go without crop insurance because, the bankers won't let them.
Yep.
People in this part of the world, I hear them talk about how the weather is changing and how things are different. People agree, and people agree that the climate changes and that humans probably have some impact on it, but they're wholly suspicious of the entire technocracy, vote to, we've got to change, we've got to fix the climate, and you need to give us your money, and you need to give us control. Because they largely think of it as a Trojan horse and a way to destroy their places and remove their control from the world. And, you can say it's a conspiracy, but the ones who keep asking for those things keep proving them correct.
Right.
So I would say we're not eager to do something that's going to hand over control to people that think about, that we're suspicious of, that rightly feel like they're trying to take away
Technocrats, yeah.
Exactly right. Trying to take away our agency.
Right.
But we know in our part of the world that we've got to adapt to the land. And, our farmers in the part of the world, they till a lot less than they used to. They've implemented cover crops and strip tilling and are always looking for new ideas. My wife is actually the executive vice president of the Rolling Plains Cotton Growers, which is the kind of the trade association for those cotton growers around here. And, those guys have been pushing, because the dryland cotton, they farm in skip rows. They don't farm in every row. They'll do like a 2 rows in, 1 row out pattern, and every farmer has a different pattern. They've tried to advocate within the Farm Bill that those things are climate smart, that they're trying to use less seed, trying to use less chemical, trying to work within the boundaries of the land. In Australia, they don't have crop insurance in Australia, and they do ultra wide rows, like 100 inches between the rows. They won't let us do that in America because the crop insurance won't pay for that. But that's a drought smart management tactic. So our folks would love to do everything they possibly could to adapt to the land and live within the boundaries of what will make them money. But the standards of the giant bill that it requires to farm in America in the year of our Lord 2024 kind of inhibits them, because their lenders and the crop insurance and their input suppliers have a say in it, and their landlords too.
Yeah, I'm sure Nate has more to say on this, but I'll just say I think that we are actually in a period right now where what gets defined as climate smart is very much in flux, and it could either go in the direction of highly technocratic, highly consolidated, like corporate ag, or it could go toward legit regen ag practices. And I think there is money going towards both right now. And it's not like it has to be either or, but if like a highly technocratic bodies and highly motivated to take money or make money bodies, like where it's like you have to use these drought resistant genetically modified seeds that only Monsanto has patented, type group wins out, it'll be a lot worse, than
the
alternative.
It kind of does need to be either or, and we need to win. Actually, and I'm glad, obviously, that we moved kind of to agriculture a little more, because it kind of answers my answer to the question that I posed a bit ago, which is the basis of a rural economy, which is for most places, not all. There's different and there's different resources. There's mining, there's forestry, there's things like that. For a lot of rural places, it's agriculture. Like, that is the basis, in my opinion, for a thriving rural economy. It's not the only thing there is, but it's where you start. It's sort of like, that's how you are creating value is that way. And one thing I appreciate about this conversation is that you're like very strongly and clearly a non-ideologue, a pragmatic person, which is really what we need, and you're talking about, well, I don't necessarily, can't just rage against the machine or submit to the machine. It's like, well, how do you carve out and work within the machine? And so I think about this a lot in the context of the USDA, right? Because I just follow that really closely. And the USDA is the damn machine right now. But it's like, how do you carve out within that these kind of quote climate smart practices that can be useful and good and help us build something, help localities build something, instead of making it harder to change and making it harder to do things differently and making it you're only incentivized to do things this one destructive way. So we kind of have to do that pragmatic work within the machine in order to support building something from the ground up that is viable and strong and thriving. And I'm curious about any comments on that too, but I also want to put a pin in. I want us not in this conversation. I would be remiss to end this conversation. You expressed a real interest in mental health, which is my actual job, so we probably should touch on that at some point. But go ahead with if you had any comments or thoughts on that. Agriculture is culture, and kind of the deepening that thread.
That's exactly right. And probably if there's a single person that I've tweeted about more negatively more often than Earl Butz, I'm not aware of it. But the late, the mid-century USDA policies of get big or get out, farm fence row to fence row. You read Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America, and he really, really despises Earl Butz, and rightly so. And it wasn't just Butz. Ezra Benson, who was the Secretary of Agriculture um, under Eisenhower, was actually the first one to coin the "get big or get out" idea. And Butz
Well, and
was his
let's take a second to, you mentioned this, and let's just take a second to that Unsettling of America. I mean, that book was prophetic. Like everything that he wrote about has just been like, yep, that's what happened. I mean,
Yep.
he saw the currents that were happening, and he completely nailed it. You read that book, and it's like, this is telling the future.
And it's continuing to accelerate. I mean, it's just the line has been a straight line since then.
You read that book and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really negative, and this is very concerning. Wait, all like 95% of this all came true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that idea of, using farmers to feed the world, which is something that we're all told is a good thing, but really that was just a scam to win the Cold War. We didn't care whether the farmers fed the world or not. We were just trying to put cheap food out before and to woo people away from the communists. But the get big or get out idea destroyed rural communities all across the world. People went from farming 160 acres to 5,000 acres. And they had to.
What happened to all the other farmers?
Yeah, they all went home. They left. They moved away. Their kids moved away. Those people were never replaced. And small businesses, and people say, "Oh, I'm not a farmer. What does it matter?" You look at the number of barbers, grocery stores, movie theaters, car dealers, dry goods, retail shops, hardware stores, all of the things that Stanford had in the census in like 1945, because I've got a copy of that, the list of all the businesses, relative to what we have now, as a direct result of agriculture becoming larger and more mechanized and using less labor, and the farmers getting bigger. And, I don't know how we pull out from, that's where you get into the machine. I don't know how we, I've had guys, I know a guy that told me one time he farms between 5,000 and 10,000 acres of cotton. And he told me years ago, he's like, man, I'd love to farm 1,000 acres. I'd love to farm 600 acres. That would be so much less stressful. But I just can't. When a cotton stripper costs over $1 million, John Deere is selling that same cotton stripper in Brazil for $300,000, but let's not go there right now. But basically, you've got the entire, in The Unsettling of America, Berry talks about basically like the axis between agriculture policymakers, the giant agribusiness corporations, and academia and land grant institutions. And I went to one of those major land grant institutions, and I look and see how they contributed to that over the years to facilitate the large scale agriculture and how much it has harmed our communities. One of my favorite inspirations in that world is Will Harris from White Oak Pastures down in that guy. You listen to him talking, you're not even sure that he's even speaking the same language you are because of that South Georgia accent. But Will talks about the fact how it infuriates him that he's selling beef to people all over the country, that he wishes that he was only selling beef no farther than Atlanta, that there should be farmers in Colorado and Pennsylvania and all these other places that are selling beef to their people, and he shouldn't be having to sell beef to them. My wife comes from a ranch 2 counties over. She's the 6th generation owner of that. And, her family started a direct beef business in 2020. It was kind of born out of some neighbors and stuff like, hey, we really like your beef. Try it out. So, we're selling it at the farmers market here in the markets in Stanford, and we can't keep up with demand. We're trying to figure out how to add more cattle into the feeding rotation to sell it. It takes a lot of that, the individual patchwork of what can we sell? How do we do that? Encourage others to do it. But the numbers don't work. The numbers don't work on their own. Joel Salatin has talked about the fact that his farm would not work if it was not for his speaking fees and his other income. He's the most famous small farmer in America.
I know.
Wendell Berry didn't get rich farming with mules like Wendell Berry had his writing career. So it takes the lawyers, it takes the computer remote workers, it takes the, people that work in finance and the teachers. And, I hate the term side hustle, and the gig economy and all that, but it's the old timey way of that, of us finding locally, like we all have a day job, but then we do something that we're passionate about, whether it's growing flowers for a greenhouse to sell to the local flower shop, or it's vegetables, or it's beef, or it's pork, or it's eggs. We've got people in Stanford selling eggs and honey, and they all have outside incomes, but they're trying to do those things and just building that up. And that's how we, slowly wrest control away from the get big or get out mentality.
Yeah, and that's actually like not that unusual historically to have like people cobbling together a lot of different ways to make a living and producing, and it's not really it's actually pretty traditional to do that. And so I just want to highlight part of what we've been talking about lately with doomer optimism, now that we've kind of developed an umbrella and a self-consciousness of like what we are and who gets drawn to our circle, is thinking about supporting specific projects, specific people, highlighting these different examples and that kind of thing. And I'm like, the more you talk, James, the more it becomes clear, like it's kind of this radical, and I don't want to say centrism, but middle ground between the extremes of totally give in to the machine or totally resist the machine. It's like navigating pragmatically in the middle of that. And I also think like the focus on little by little, like linear building. But early on in doomer optimism, we had a couple like venture capitalist type funders, like, what kind of venture would you build? And I'm like, I don't think I would build a venture. Like, I don't think I could promise exponential profits, because even an exponential type growth of anything is going to have some really weird incentives. So like just a linear, little by little patchwork, experimentation, iteration, pragmatism, like that's kind of the vision we have. And it's cool to see that you're like totally in it in this small town that you're from. And I'm kind of similar in my neighborhood in Chicago, and these little by little like points of agency throughout. I want to empower people to think that way.
Trial and error is undefeated.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of like, it's got to be something newfangled and it's never been invented before. Like, hey, how about we like actually just do things that work? But I want to bring it back, since we're running, up to time, to Nate's comment, and then maybe James, if you want to kind of respond to both, but about mental health and just thinking about, maintaining mental health, I think, in a small town, and mental health as connected to community. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that question, Nate.
No, we can. No. You. I think that prompt's a good prompt to kick off a little short discussion on that.
Okay.
So it's just something that matters to me, because I've seen how suicide and depression and those things impact our rural communities, and the impact from the standpoint of we have so much crime and other issues in the community that are in our community, but in the world at large, that comes from despair. That the world that has, told individual people that they're worthless, that, they can be replaced by machines, that they've cast them aside. They work in low-paying jobs, service jobs, stuff that, they're being treated terribly. They can't make ends meet. That leads to substance abuse. That leads to crime. That leads to incarceration. That destroys families. I think something like well over half of people incarcerated in Texas in a county jail at any point in time are there due to some form of mental health issue, directly or indirectly. And it's a disaster. I mean, it has torn our communities apart, and it makes it hard for our communities to thrive. It's just something that has been on my heart for a long time, because if people feel like there's not a future in the community, it makes it hard for them to want to move back. If they saw their parents struggling with depression or alcoholism or drug abuse or suicide, they don't want to come back. They want to get away. We've seen, suicides locally. We've seen, teen suicide attempts, just because, I mean, you talk about that article in Plow about, why are we lonely? The whole world is telling us to strive and do better and tearing us apart from our roots. And it has a terrible effect on mental health. And, the stresses of farmers, the farm suicide epidemic in the 1980s, you've seen farmer suicides in India and elsewhere in the world. I mean, that's a very real thing. The Texas Department of Agriculture has worked on that a little bit in the last couple of years to try to create resources and outlets. But I'm a firm believer that we've got to talk about it. And the leaders of these communities have got to talk about, me preaching about mental health from the standpoint of people thinking, well, he didn't have anything. He's mayor, he's a lawyer, he's got everything going for him. That doesn't resonate. But one of my most well-received essays was a couple of weeks ago I wrote, and I talked about these things that, you probably call them anxiety or, ADHD or depression or some of those things where it just renders me just like unable to like work, like where I just get so stressed I can't do anything. And so me sharing that really resonated with some other people to like, oh, wow, like, let's talk about our stories. People talking about their own suicide attempts to say, hey, don't do what I did. Like, I'm here, I'm alive by the grace of God. Please reach out and help. And leaders talking about that encourage other people to talk about it and encourage everybody to say, hey, we need to do something. How do we do it? I know somebody that their middle school student has been struggling, having issues, but like, to get state supported mental health counseling, it's like a 6-month wait, which is just insane. If you're struggling, 6 months might as well be 6 years.
Right.
And so how can our local communities, that's kind of what I'm thinking about now, is how can our local communities create, a seed fund to help people get, counseling if they can't pay for it themselves? How can our churches, other community organizations support that? And really, I'm just trying to have that conversation so that people can be aware that this is something that we need to talk about, that this is important, and that this is critical to our communities continuing to exist, that people can feel like they're not alone, and they can reach out. And the neighborliness of rural communities is something that we hold with pride. But if our neighborliness does not extend to talking about people's mental health and picking people up when they're down, then it's an incomplete neighborliness.
Nate, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, you're saying you said the word we a lot, which I think is the important. And I mean, this deserves, we could probably should do some sort of a whole episode on mental health. I haven't really talked about that much on the podcast, and it is my damn job. But, and I think seed fund for counseling and all that's very good. I am a counselor, and it can make a difference. But I think that's sort of a Band-Aid solution. And I think what we spent the rest of the episode talking about more is the sort of the actual solution. I think people are lonely and in despair, and it's sort of like, I think what the idea that we're going to get a whole bunch of mental health professionals to big wave of mental health professionals sweeping the countryside, the idea that that's going to fix anything is wrong. But it can help as a triage, right? But I think we need to think of it just as a triage, because really we need to build livable, less lonely communities, and think about what solutions are on a community scale, not just on a walk into a person's office, have a conversation for an hour a week and walk out, which again can help. I see it help all the time. But really thinking about how do we make it so people can connect with each other and support each other and have like these third places that we've talked about before, where a lot of the times in a lot of small towns, I mean, there's just nowhere, there isn't anywhere to go that's open, that's not at somebody's home. And I think sometimes like just having that, unless it's a bar,
which has its own problem for people that are in recovery or struggling.
Yeah, right.
Or just don't want to go drinking every time they want to, and so there's, I mean, I think this is a much bigger conversation that we probably can't do justice to right now, but I kind of wanted to hear your perspective on it. And I think like a lot of what you're talking about is downstream of what we have been talking about this whole episode, is like that's sort of the fallout, when you lose, when you lose your entire base of the farmers, for instance, in a rural area, you go from 160-acre farms to 5,000-acre farms, and all the other farmers, you just, a bomb goes off in a way of life, and people are displaced. Well, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. Well, I would just
And
say also, like, we talked about this in the last, I think it was with Jason in the last one, but he was saying, like a lot of the kind of work James is doing and a lot of, the work that we're all thinking about and doing is kind of prefiguring a return to these, maybe not necessarily a return, but like a scaling down. And so it's cool to see, James, your work, and I'm just a huge fan. This has been so cool to hear. It's like you get to be a jack of all trades too, and you get to think about building a lot of different institutions and supporting a lot of different institutions, whether it's, like local businesses and farmers markets and farmers and ranchers and other businesses and the school sports and, community culture and all of this stuff at once, that all is interconnected with each other. And it's really cool when you think about localism as a kind of like guided curation of a place as a whole. And so part of like the issue with scale in general is just that we compartmentalize so many things. It's like mental health as one thing versus, the school sports as another thing, or just school funding in general, or farming. And it's super cool to think of how much like curation and agency you have as the mayor of this town. So I'll leave the final words to you as we wrap up.
Well, and you're right. Like all of it is downstream of our communities being livable places. And, part of that raging against the machine and the system. And it's a challenge, but people have to have a life worth living, and people have to have a sense of purpose in life. Otherwise, they end up drifting and they end up in despair. And these things are absolutely interconnected. Wendell talks about, he's not a big fan of specialization in the world because of that, because it takes growing food away from health, away from mental health, and all those things. And those are all interconnected. We've got to get back to a life built around wholeness, the holistic view of ourselves, and the holistic view of caring for the land and building strong communities.
I love that.
And that's what mental health really is. I mean, I think it's this fragmentation that we're describing a bunch of different ways. I think that's what the mental health crisis is it's a fragmentation of aspects of life that should not be separated.
Yep.
That's
well,
exactly right.
I think this is a lovely conversation. James, thanks so much for coming on. Remind everybody again of your Substack, and we'll put a link in the show notes.
So it's westof98.substack.com. And then you can find me on Twitter at JamesDecker2006, Instagram, Facebook. I'm all over the place. I spend too much time online, and that's okay. But, subscribe to the Substack. That's where it's at.
Okay. Anything else, Nate?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank y'all.
Bye-bye.